Capital Record, where we defend free enterprise and capital markets because we believe in the dignity of the human person. Hello and welcome to David Bahnsen's Capital Record, brought to you by National Review, where you've had to wait a couple extra days for our podcast. We normally do 2 per week, and we didn't do one the other day this week as I have been knee-deep in meetings in New York City, meeting with about 25 money managers, hedge funds, et cetera, that our company does business with and that we work with as asset management partners. And we do this every year where we have a kind of week-long crash course of meetings. And it reminded me of one of the years that we did this, being at the heyday of the movement formerly known as Occupy Wall Street. And I wrote about this in my very first book, Crisis of Responsibility, that one of the years, I believe it was 2011, if memory serves, that I was doing all of these different meetings here in the fall with company relationships that are related to our portfolio management process in my business, that I found myself having to walk through an Occupy Wall Street kind of protest to get into one of our bond managers' offices, and got into a bit of an argument with some people that were, shall we say, not well showered and whatnot. But either way, saw me with a briefcase and a suit and tie and got into a little bit. And so I kind of tell the whole story in the book about it, and it's all fine. But the Occupy Wall Street moment represented this sort of left-wing populism and left-wing revolt against a lot of the issues and things that had happened at the point of the 2008 financial crisis. I don't think there was ever a lot of specificity as to what exactly they wanted. I know people were upset at Wall Street for the financial crisis. That's all easy enough, and in fact, fair enough. And as I wrote about in my book, Crisis of Responsibility, there were plenty of people that work in finance that did some unspeakably stupid things in advance of the financial crisis. But really, Occupy Wall Street turned into more of a philosophical issue of hating markets, hating capitalism, hating free enterprise, and believing that a lot of the pain that went through in the financial crisis was related to the bad incentives of a free market economy. And that has largely kind of been forgotten. And yet, I think the fact that there is this 2008 seminal moment in history that did fundamentally change a lot of public perception about markets and about free enterprise, not merely these kind of unshowered hippies screaming obscenities in front of finance offices in 2011, camping out in the park and all these types of things. That they were kind of like this very brief sort of hippie-like moment that was easy to caricaturize as somewhat radicals and a little juvenile and whatnot. That's all fine, but it kind of hides over the fact that actually I believe there was a really deep level of paradigm shift in the way our society thinks about free enterprise. And I have spoken about this for many years now and brought this up and alluded to it as often as I can, and I'm doing it on the podcast now, that the burden of proof for the moral superiority of a market economy was realigned after 2008. And I don't necessarily think it's for a good reason, but it doesn't matter what I think. That the Randians, that the Gordon Geckos, that the atomistic defenders of markets, those who would make a secular argument that free markets just sort of in a Darwinian sense lead to better outcomes, and that they better, more properly align incentives, and the efficiencies are impossible to dispute, and then they can use accurate historical arguments. But divorcing a defense of free enterprise from a moral foundation has become impossible to do. And the 80s and 90s made it very easy to, especially in the aftermath of the one Cold War, the failures of various 20th century endeavors into both not only totalitarian Marxism, known as communism, but even lighter Marxism known as socialism. that the efficiencies of a market economy were almost indisputed in the 80s, 90s, and that '08 represented a time for some folks to push back and not merely people that became kind of characterized around Occupy Wall Street. Well, there's a link in the show notes today to an article that the Wall Street Journal ran over the weekend called The Rise of America's Young Socialists from the 2008 Financial Crisis to Mamdani. And basically, in this article, they go about trying to make a point that I have been making on the speaking circuit and in podcasting and in writings for a long time, that there is a point in history at which the numbers shifted, the sentiment shifted, and it didn't just fizzle out when that Occupy Wall Street silliness fizzled. And that right now, the fact that the country's biggest city is about to elect a socialist mayor, and that I've made the point before Mamdani using Bernie Sanders as the example, and of course AOC, that some significant left-wing progressive political figures are self-avowed socialists was unthinkable before 2008. And I believe that the article is right to point out, as a point in history, that there was a lot of younger people radicalized out of the '08 moment. What I think it's wrong to do is say that this was because 2008 represented a time where capitalism was taking people's houses, that capitalism was so inefficiently working. I believe that we have to properly understand what happened at the point of financial crisis as a failure of governmental interventions, as a failure of morality in Wall Street and the right limitations in credit markets, as a failure of monetary policy to facilitate excessive risk taking for so long. But then fundamentally, the part that is easiest and most desirable for people to ignore, a failure of Main Street, that the covetousness and envy that took over the American population, particularly manifested in its relationship to the housing sector, has nothing to do with the free enterprise system, nothing to do with Wall Street, nothing to do with the excesses of capitalism. It was a crisis of responsibility. And so there's a gal they use as an example who was in Santa Ana, California at the time, had been a community college organizer. I don't know exactly what that means. A community organizer who was, I think, at a community college, whatever. But the point being, she's now a Mamdani advocate and grassroots person working for various, pretty progressive, radical, and self-avowed. I'm not using any of this pejoratively. I'm steel manning their argument. Self-avowed socialist tendencies. And they talk about, the parents losing the homes, and that basically what they saw at the time was that the entire country was screwed over by rich and powerful people. Well, there were rich and powerful people who did bad things. There was a lot of people on Main Street doing really bad things. And it was a fundamental breakdown of the part of a market economy that I believe is necessary to sustain it, which is what I refer to as the other half of my vision for a free and virtuous society. And those of us who believe that perfect virtue will not be obtained on this side of glory, then have a choice to make between which imperfect system is going to most align with social cooperation, totalitarianism, socialism, collectivism, central planning, or that of a market economy. And I do believe freedom does it best, but it does it much better with the undergirdings of moral culture. And when we look back to the 2008 moment, those of us that wake up every day and don't want more AOCs, don't want more socialists in the faculty lounges at our colleges, don't want more community organizers advocating for price control, rent control, government take over the economy in the name of doing the morally right thing. What they have done right on the left, the far left, the socialist case, is make a moral argument. What they've done wrong is make the wrong moral argument. And of course, for the wrong reason, a wrong vision of the human person, not a vision rooted to believing the human person can operate and flourish in freedom and is not in need of being taken care of by a paternalistic relationship with the state. I will leave my podcast here today because rather than exhaustively cover this topic, I mostly wanted to accent the Wall Street Journal's article to say, yes, 2008 changed history, but it did not do it because capitalism failed. It did it because we have to tell the whole story, which is not merely free enterprise, but it is a free and virtuous society where we undergird, underlie, and try to build up and embolden the institutions necessary to defend and sustain these concepts of morality, of integrity, of trustworthiness in our economic exchange. And I believe that that vision of a free and virtuous society that we promote here at Capitol Record, organizations like National Review, the Acton Institute, and there's so many others, brothers and sisters in the cause, we have the antidote to Mamdani. What does not have the antidote to Mamdani in terms of animating the hearts and souls of young people is any defense of a market economy rooted to some sort of survival of the fittest, atomistic, greed is good, Randian, virtue of selfishness argument. Those things are philosophically vacuous. And what we can defend and allow us to move generationally past the 2008 moment and the Occupy Wall Street embarrassment is a free and virtuous society. Thank you for listening to David Bahnsen's Capitol Record. Look forward to being back with you next week.